came to Harlem for a job, but something felt wrong.
Harlem, winter of 1933. The snow came down in slow, tired sheets, soft enough to look harmless, cold enough to bury a man's footprints before sunrise. By midnight, Lenox Avenue had gone quiet, except for the jazz leaking out of basement clubs and the distant rattle of trains heading downtown. That was when the rumors started moving from doorway to doorway, whispered by bartenders, runners, and men who knew the price of bad news. The Mafia had sent a killer for Bumpy Johnson. Not a crew, not a warning, just one man. And the people who knew the underworld best understood why that made it worse. A crew could be frightened. A crew could be delayed. A single killer with nothing to prove was a different kind of storm. And this one was already somewhere inside the city, walking toward Harlem like he had all the time in the world. Before we go on, tell me in the comments where you're watching this video from, and subscribe to the channel. Bumpy heard the rumor before most people did, but he didn't flinch. He sat in the back room of a narrow restaurant on 131st Street, one hand around a glass of tea gone cold, the other resting on a folded newspaper he had stopped reading 10 minutes earlier. He was listening instead. Listening to the kitchen noises. Listening to the old radiator hiss. Listening to the silence between footsteps outside. Men who had worked with him for years stood around the room waiting for instructions, but Bumpy kept his eyes on the window. Finally, one of them, a young runner named Caleb, asked the question everyone else was too smart to ask. "You want us to move you?" Bumpy smiled faintly. "Move me where?" he said. "A man comes to Harlem looking for me. He already expects me to hide. I don't like giving strangers what they expect." Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe. The killer's name was Nico Valenti, though most men in Chicago knew him by another name, the Pilgrim. Nobody agreed on who gave him that nickname first. Some said it was because he crossed state lines like a man on a holy mission. Others said it was because of the way he dressed. Dark coat, clean collar, leather gloves, and the kind of stillness that made him look less like a gangster and more like a mourner on his way to church. He had been born in Newark, raised between church steps and pool halls, and by 34, he had already buried more men than most cops had arrested. He never drank before a job, never bragged after one, never asked for a second payment. That was why the Mafia trusted him with delicate work. Bumpy Johnson wasn't supposed to be humiliated. He was supposed to disappear, quietly, permanently, and by dawn. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and subscribe if you want more stories like this. But Nico hadn't taken this job because he hated Bumpy Johnson. He had taken it because life had cornered him the way it corners men who think they still have time left to choose better. In a small private hospital in Brooklyn, his younger sister Elena lay recovering from an operation she couldn't afford. She was the last blood family he had. The doctor had been clear, the medicine had to continue, and the bills had to be paid in cash. The men who hired Nico knew that. Men like that always knew where the soft flesh was under the armor. They offered enough money to save Elena, and enough threat to bury her if he refused. Nico accepted the envelope, folded the photograph of Bumpy Johnson into his pocket, and boarded the night train for New York. By the time he stepped onto the platform, the decision already felt older than he was. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and make sure you subscribe. Officially, the reason for the hit was business. A syndicate broker named Don Salerno had been trying to push narcotics deeper into Harlem through backroom clubs and borrowed storefronts. Bumpy had shut him down twice. First by burning a shipment that came in through Jersey, then by sending a driver back alive with a message nobody could misunderstand. Harlem would not become another market for men who made money from children's graves. That insult cost Salerno face, and face mattered almost as much as money. But beneath the business was something smaller and uglier: pride. Salerno had grown tired of hearing Bumpy's name spoken with respect by men who only said his own name with fear. So he made a private call, wrote a private check, and sent a private killer into New York to solve the problem cleanly. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and subscribe to support the channel. Nico spent his first hour in Harlem doing what he always did. He watched. He stood beneath a flickering theater sign on 7th Avenue and studied the neighborhood like a map that could suddenly move. He saw boys sweeping snow from a church step at midnight because the priest had bad lungs. He saw a woman in a green coat hand half her bread to a shoeless man without waiting for thanks. He saw music drifting through basement windows and old men playing cards under a tailor's light, talking with the easy confidence of people who still believed the night belonged to them. Nico had killed in rich neighborhoods before, and poor ones too. But this place felt different. Not safe. Never safe. But held together by something stronger than fear. That unsettled him more than armed guards would have. Neighborhoods like this didn't just protect a man. Sometimes they became him. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and subscribe before we continue. At 1:10 in the morning, Bumpy finally left the restaurant. No heavy escort, no dramatic exit, just a dark overcoat, a fedora tilted slightly back, and the unhurried walk of a man who refused to let danger set his pace. Caleb followed at a distance, along with 2 other men, but Bumpy had ordered them not to crowd him. Nico saw all of it from across the street. He could have taken the shot then. The angle was there, the wind was quiet, the sidewalk had cleared. But just as his hand moved inside his coat, Bumpy stopped beneath a street lamp and turned his head. Not enough to fully face Nico, just enough to make it impossible to believe he didn't know. Then Bumpy raised a gloved hand and adjusted his hat like a man greeting someone late to an appointment. Nico's fingers went still around the pistol. For the first time in years, he let a perfect opening pass. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe. Bumpy walked another 2 blocks and stepped into a closed flower shop whose back room stayed open after midnight for people who dealt in numbers, favors, and whispered debts. Nico crossed the street 2 minutes later and waited in the alley behind it. He expected guards. He expected a back exit. He expected movement. What he got instead was a little girl in a wool cap opening the rear door with a jar in both hands. She nearly ran into him. Nico froze. The girl looked up at his face, then at the gloves, then at the alley behind him. "You waitin' on Mr. Johnson?" she asked innocently. Nico said nothing. She held up the jar. "He said this soup goes to Mrs. Carter on 129th. She can't climb stairs no more." Then she slipped past him into the snow, like he wasn't death in a dark coat, just another tired man in Harlem. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and subscribe if you're enjoying the story. That was how the night began to go wrong for Nico Valenti. Not with bullets, not with sirens, with small things that forced him to see Bumpy Johnson as something harder to kill than a target. At 1:40, Bumpy came back out carrying no gun in his hands, no visible fear on his face. Instead of heading home, he stopped beneath a broken awning where an old shoeshine man sat wrapped in blankets. Bumpy knelt in the snow, said something Nico couldn't hear, and slid folded bills into the man's coat. The old man touched Bumpy's wrist, and whatever he whispered made Bumpy's expression change, just for a second, just enough to show the tiredness underneath. Nico had seen hardened men act kind before. Usually it was vanity, a performance, but no one else was even there to see it. That was what made it dangerous. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel. A little after 2, Nico finally closed the distance. Bumpy had entered a basement jazz club through a side door, with only Caleb beside him. Nico moved through the kitchen entrance, silent as steam, and reached the corridor outside the club office. Music trembled through the walls. A trumpet cried somewhere out front. He drew the pistol, thumbed back the hammer, and stepped toward the half-open office door. Then he heard Bumpy speaking, not to a bodyguard, not to a lieutenant, but to a woman who sounded like she was trying not to cry. "Your boy will be buried proper," Bumpy said quietly. "You hear me? Proper. No collection plate, no charity. He gets a name on the stone." The woman sobbed once. "He was 14, Bumpy said, voice low now. "That ain't a debt. That's a theft." Nico lowered the gun before he realized he had. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and make sure you subscribe. The dead boy's name was Isaiah Reed. He had caught a stray bullet 3 nights earlier, not from Bumpy's people, not from police, but from 2 men pushing Salerno's narcotics corners farther uptown. Bumpy had paid for the funeral and promised the mother he would not let her son's name disappear into alley talk. Nico learned all this by standing in that corridor and hearing grief from the wrong side of his gun. When Bumpy stepped out a minute later, Nico had already disappeared into the kitchen. But he carried the boy's name with him into the snow. On his next pass around the block, he noticed black ribbons tied to 2 lampposts and 3 candles burning low in a second-floor window. Harlem wasn't whispering because Bumpy might die tonight. Harlem was already grieving someone else. And suddenly, the hit felt less like business and more like punishment, delivered to the wrong street. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and subscribe before we move on. At 2:25, Nico found the message. It was tucked beneath the windshield wiper of the borrowed sedan he had used from the station. 1 clean white card, no envelope, no signature. On the front, in neat block letters, were 6 words. "If you came for Bumpy, come alone." On the back was an address he recognized immediately. A shuttered chapel on 134th Street that had burned years earlier and never reopened. Nico read the card twice, then checked the roof lines, the windows, the dark intersections for movement. Nothing. That bothered him more than if he had spotted 20 men. He should have left Harlem right then. A smart killer would have. But smart and trapped were not always opposites. He thought of Elena in Brooklyn. He thought of the unpaid medicine. Then he slid the card into his pocket and started walking toward the chapel with his hand near the gun and doubt growing heavier with every block. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe. The chapel smelled like dust, wet wood, and candles that had not burned in years. Moonlight pushed through the broken stained glass in pale slashes, throwing blue and red shapes across the cracked floor. Nico entered through the side door and found Bumpy Johnson already there, standing in front of the old altar with his hat in his hands. No escort, no weapon visible. Just the man half the East Coast had opinions about, waiting in silence like this meeting had been his idea from the start. "You took your time," Bumpy said. Nico kept the pistol low but ready. "You sent for me?" Bumpy nodded. "I did." He looked up at the broken saints in the windows. "Felt like the right kind of place for truth. Men lie easier in clubs." Nico didn't answer. He was listening for movement outside. Bumpy noticed. "There are men outside," he said calmly. "They're not mine." Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. Nico's grip tightened. What does that mean? Bumpy's eyes rested on him without blinking. It means the men who sent you don't trust you to finish and walk away. He reached slowly into his coat, and Nico raised the pistol. Easy, Bumpy said. If I wanted you dead, you'd have met me from the floor, not the doorway. He pulled out a folded envelope and placed it on a pew. Take it. Nico did not move. What is it? A reason they needed you desperate, Bumpy said, and a reason you were never supposed to make it back. Nico took one step closer, keeping the gun between them, and snatched the envelope with his free hand. Inside was a hospital ledger page and a carbon copy payment note. At the bottom was Elena's name. The bill had already been settled by Don Salerno's office, 2 days before Nico even left Chicago. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and subscribe if this story has you hooked. For a moment, Nico just stared at the paper. The numbers blurred, then sharpened again. Paid in advance. Not as kindness, not as a favor, as leverage. The line beneath it was worse. Further treatment suspended pending final confirmation. Nico's mouth went dry. They bought her before they bought me, he said, barely above a whisper. Bumpy's expression did not change. Men like Salerno don't hire loyalty, he said. They rent fear. Nico looked up sharply. Why tell me this? Bumpy placed his hat back on his head. Because if you pull that trigger tonight, your sister still dies later. Men who know too much don't get retirement money. They get a second gun behind them. As if to prove the point, a floorboard creaked outside the chapel. Then another. Somebody was moving into position in the dark. If you like this story, subscribe my channel for more beautiful stories. Nico backed toward a stone pillar and aimed toward the rear window. How many? He asked. Bumpy listened for 2 seconds. At least 3, maybe 4. One by the alley, one near the front steps, the others waiting for sound. Nico laughed once, bitter and low. So you set me up for a sermon and an execution. Bumpy shook his head. No, they set both of us up for a funeral. I just got here early. Then Bumpy did something stranger than any threat. He told Nico to sit down. In a burned chapel, with gunmen outside and betrayal still settling into his bones, Bumpy Johnson pointed to a pew like a schoolmaster. Sit, he repeated. If a man's going to choose what kind of devil he serves, he ought to do it with a steady heart. Against all sense, Nico sat. Because suddenly, the night no longer belonged to the job. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and make sure you subscribe. Bumpy sat across from him and spoke without theatrics. He told Nico about Salerno's narcotics plan, about the boys already dying young, about the mothers burying children before they had learned how to shave. He spoke about Isaiah Reed, 14 years old, bright enough to fix broken radios, dead because Prophet had wandered into the wrong block. Then Bumpy said something Nico did not expect. I know what it is to be used by men who call it opportunity. The line landed harder because he didn't dress it up. You think I was born on top of my choices? Bumpy asked. No. I just learned quicker than some that every powerful man wants another man to do his drowning for him. Nico stared at the pistol in his lap. The chapel had gone so quiet he could hear snow sliding from the roof. Outside, the waiting men kept waiting. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. Then Bumpy reached into his coat once more and pulled out a photograph, old and cracked at the edges. He placed it on the pew between them. Nico looked down and felt the blood leave his face. The picture showed his older brother Marco standing outside a warehouse in Newark 8 years earlier, one arm around a laughing woman in a flowered dress. Salerno stood in the background near a car, half turned away, thinking no one had noticed him. Marco had died that same week in what everyone called a police mix-up. "Where did you get this?" Nico asked. Bumpy's voice was soft now. "From a man who carried guilt longer than he carried breath. Salerno gave up your brother's route to the police, then told your family it was bad luck." Nico could not speak. Sometimes terror is not hearing a lie. It is finally hearing the truth. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe. The first shot from outside shattered a side window and sprayed colored glass across the floor like ice. Nico dropped instinctively. Bumpy did not. He simply stepped behind the stone altar and said, "Now you know whose clock you were on." Another shot cracked from the alley, then a third. The gunmen weren't trying to rescue Nico. They were tightening the mouth of the trap. Nico crawled to the broken window, fired twice into the dark, and heard a curse. Somewhere near the door, boots scraped on old steps. Bumpy finally drew a pistol from under his coat, a small revolver, worn smooth at the grip, and handed Nico 3 extra rounds from his pocket. That shook Nico more than the bullets. "Why help me?" he asked. Bumpy's eyes hardened. "Because tonight the men outside are worse for Harlem than the one they sent in." Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and subscribe if you want the rest of this story. What happened next frightened Nico in a way gunfire never had. Bumpy began giving orders into the dark, not shouting, not panicking, just speaking certain names in a calm voice. "Caleb," he called once. "Rear alley." Then, "Miss Lorna, lights." A second later, every street lamp outside the chapel went dead at once. The entire block dropped into blackness so complete that even the gunmen stopped shooting for a breath. Then whistles answered from 3 different corners. Doors opened, windows lifted. Harlem itself woke up, not with chaos, but with coordination. Women blew police whistles from tenement windows. Men dragged trash cans into the street as cover. Someone rang the church bell 3 times from the neighboring parish. Nico realized with cold amazement that Bumpy had not built an empire only with guns. He had built something more frightening, a neighborhood that listened when he whispered. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and make sure you subscribe. In the confusion, 2 of Salerno's cleanup men rushed the front door. Nico shot the first in the shoulder. Bumpy struck the second across the face with the butt of his revolver before the man could fire. A third man fled toward the alley and ran straight into Caleb and 2 others who seemed to rise out of the dark snow itself. Within 30 seconds, the trap had folded inward. The men outside had expected a target and a witness. They had not expected a community already prepared for the sound of betrayal. When the last gunman was dragged into the chapel, bleeding from the head and cursing through broken teeth, Nico looked at him and recognized one of Salerno's quiet enforcers from Chicago. That was proof enough. Salerno had never intended to let him return. The realization settled into Nico's bones like cold rain. For the first time in years, he was not the hunter. He was the almost dead. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. Bumpy crouched beside the captured gunman and asked only one question. "What were the instructions after the hit?" The man spat blood onto the floor and refused to answer. Bumpy nodded as if he had expected that. Then he turned to Nico instead. "You ask him." Nico frowned. Why me? Bumpy's reply came without hesitation. Because traitors don't fear justice, they fear recognition. Nico stepped forward slowly, looked the man in the face, and said his name. Tommy Ricci. The effect was immediate. The man's bravado cracked. He hadn't expected to be known by the dead man standing beside Bumpy Johnson. We were told to wait for the shot, Tommy muttered, eyes darting. And put one in the pilgrim, too. Take both bodies if possible. Burn the chapel if not. The words echoed off broken stained glass and hung there like smoke. Even the wounded men looked ashamed. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe. Bumpy stood and looked at Nico for a long moment. Now you can still shoot me, he said, almost gently. Take your chance. Tell yourself the men outside changed nothing. Nico looked down at the revolver in his hand, then at the broken chapel, then at the blood on Tommy Ricci's collar. In that moment, he saw the whole shape of the night. Salerno had chosen him because desperate men were easy to move and easy to bury. Elena was never meant to be saved. Marco was never avenged. He himself was just a final loose page in a ledger other men kept. Nico lowered the gun. No, he said. The word felt smaller than the choice behind it. Bumpy nodded once, not triumphant, just certain. Good, he said. Then the next part gets dangerous. Nico almost laughed. Dangerous compared to what? Bumpy's eyes went flat. Compared to survival. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and subscribe before we continue. The plan Bumpy laid out was simple enough to sound impossible. By dawn, Nico would go downtown to the Hotel Marquette, where Salerno's men were waiting for confirmation. He would carry Bumpy's fedora, stained with chapel blood, and tell them the job was finished. He would say cleanup men had handled the body and that the chapel burned too fast to retrieve anything else. Salerno, thinking the street had been cleaned, would relax. And relaxed men with power did stupid things. He'll want to speak freely, Bumpy said. Men like him always do when they believe the dead can't answer back. Nico understood the trap instantly. You want him to confess? No, Bumpy replied. I want him to reveal who he thinks is expendable. Then Bumpy took off his hat and placed it in Nico's hands. The lining was warm. Somehow, that made the mission feel heavier than any gun. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel. Before Nico left, Bumpy walked him to the chapel door. The snow had stopped, and the first gray edge of dawn was beginning to show above the rooftops. Your sister's at St. Agnes in Brooklyn, Bumpy said quietly. Nico turned sharply. How do you know that? Bumpy looked down the street, not at him. Because after I heard your name, I checked, and because no one gets sent after me without me learning what hurt put them on the train. Nico did not know what to say. Bumpy reached into his coat and handed him a small packet of folded bills. For Elena's medicine, he said. Nico stared at the money, stunned. Why? Bumpy finally looked at him. Because I don't need gratitude from a man they already broke. I need him standing straight. It was the kindest thing anyone had done for Nico in years, and it scared him more than threats ever had. If you like this story, subscribe my channel for more beautiful stories. The Hotel Marquette kept its private meetings on the 4th floor, where the carpet swallowed footsteps and the windows were always shut, even when the city baked in summer. Nico arrived just after sunrise carrying a leather case. 2 men frisked him in the hallway and found only the pistol Salerno expected him to have. When he entered the suite, Don Salerno sat at the end of a long table with a silver coffee tray near one hand and a cigar he had not yet lit in the other. He smiled when he saw the case. "I knew you were worth the price," he said. Nico said nothing. He set the case on the table, opened it, and lifted out Bumpy's fedora. There was blood on the brim, dark and convincing. Salerno leaned back, satisfied. Around the room, shoulders lowered. Men who believe danger is finished always reveal themselves too quickly. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe. Salerno picked up the hat with 2 fingers and smiled the way some men smile at tax papers or signed deeds. "Harlem will be easier now," he said. "A pity about the pilgrim, though. I hear you had to lose the chapel and the extra men." Nico looked at him evenly. "The extra men were your insurance." Salerno shrugged. "Insurance is for people who matter." A few of the others chuckled. Then Salerno made the mistake Bumpy had predicted. He began talking too much. He spoke of Marco's death as useful history. He spoke of Elena as collateral leverage. He spoke of Nico as if he were already gone, just another asset about to be written off after one last service. Nico listened without blinking, but inside, something old and buried finally split open. When Salerno reached for the coffee, Nico understood that every word in the room had become evidence, not for court, but for judgment. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and subscribe if you're still with me. What Salerno didn't know was that the hat wasn't the only thing Nico had carried in. Sewn beneath the lining of his coat was a tiny recording device borrowed from a bookmaker who owed Bumpy 3 favors and had a habit of preserving blackmail for rainy days. The machine was crude, but it did not need elegance. It only needed Salerno's voice, his confidence, and his contempt. Nico let the silence stretch until the room grew uncomfortable. Then he asked one final question. "And after me?" Salerno looked straight at him and answered with the carelessness of a man who had stopped pretending. "After you," he said, "we tell Elena her brother died useful." That was the line. The final one. Nico drew his pistol so fast that 3 men rose too late. He did not fire at Salerno first. He shot the door lock behind him. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and make sure you subscribe. The shot echoed once, and then the room changed shape. Men grabbed for weapons. Chairs crashed backward. Salerno half stood, face whitening with rage. But before anyone could rush Nico, the suite door opened from the outside anyway. Caleb entered first with 2 armed men beside him, calm as debt collectors. Behind them came Bumpy Johnson, hatless, alive, and walking as if he had been expected all along. What happened next terrified everyone in the room, not because of gunfire, but because of the look on Salerno's face. Real fear. Raw, childlike, unbelieving fear. He had lived long enough to understand exactly what it meant when a dead man walked into a private room carrying witnesses. Bumpy said nothing at first. He simply crossed the carpet, took his fedora from Salerno's trembling hand, and brushed imaginary dust from the brim like he had all morning to spare. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe. Salerno tried to bargain immediately. Men like him always do. First with money, then with information, then with names. But the room had moved past bargaining. Nico placed the recorder on the table and rewound it just enough for Salerno to hear his own voice speaking about Marco, Elena, and assets too disposable to outlive their usefulness. The sound was not loud, but it was devastating. Around the table, the other men stopped looking at Bumpy and started looking at Salerno. Not with loyalty, with calculation. Because once one boss openly admitted he killed his own to protect his books, every man in that room had to wonder whether he was next. That was the true terror of the morning. Not death, uncertainty. The sudden understanding that their own side had become more dangerous than the enemy they had hired a killer to erase. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. No newspapers reported what followed in that suite, and maybe that is why the story lasted. Some said Salerno begged on his knees. Some said he reached for a hidden pistol and lost the hand before he touched it. Some said Bumpy walked out without firing a shot, because men like Salerno collapse faster when their allies abandon them. What is known is simpler. By noon, Salerno's roots were frozen. His accounts vanished into other names. His closest lieutenants stopped answering doors, and Nico Valenti disappeared from the world that had built him. Elena's medicine was paid for in cash, every bill of it. Harlem did not celebrate loudly. It never needed to. It just breathed easier. Because the most frightening thing about that night was not that the Mafia sent a killer after Bumpy. It was that the killer found out the monster behind the contract was wearing his own colors. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and subscribe if you want more beautiful stories. Years later, old men in uptown card rooms still told the story in low voices whenever winter came back hard and the sidewalks shone black after midnight. They would say, the killer entered Harlem like an executioner and left it like a witness. They would say, Bumpy never beat him with force alone. He beat him with patience, with truth, and with the terrifying habit of knowing what pain brought men to his door. Some swore Nico was seen once more on a Brooklyn street, walking beside a woman in a wool scarf who looked healthy enough to laugh again. Others claimed he lit candles every year for Marco, in a church nobody important ever visited. Maybe both stories were true. Maybe neither was. But the lessons stayed the same. A man can survive bullets and betrayal. What ruins him forever is the moment he realizes he was never meant to be saved. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe. And Bumpy? Bumpy kept walking Harlem the same way he always had. Hat low, shoulders easy, eyes open. He knew better than most men that power was not loud for long. It had to be fed, managed, protected. But after that winter night, people stopped asking whether Bumpy Johnson could survive the men sent after him. The better question became this: what did a man see in Bumpy's world that could make him lower a loaded gun and turn it back toward the people who hired him? That question traveled farther than any headline. It reached Chicago, Newark, Brooklyn. It reached private offices where powerful men suddenly checked the door twice before speaking freely. Because if one killer could be turned, then fear was no longer a leash. It was a fuse. And once lit, it burned both ways. If you like this story, subscribe my channel for more beautiful stories. So when people say the Mafia sent a killer after Bumpy Johnson, they usually lean closer, expecting the story to end with bullets in the street, blood in the snow, and another body carried out before dawn. But that is not the part that terrified everyone. The terrifying part was quieter. A contract killer arrived with death in his pocket and left with truth in his hands. A boss who thought fear made him untouchable discovered fear could also empty a room around him. And a city built on whispers learned that sometimes the most powerful man is not the one who fires first, but the one who already knows why the gun was raised. In the end, the killer did not become a legend because he took Bumpy's life. He became one because he couldn't. Because one night in Harlem, he finally saw who the real enemy was. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel for more stories. If you like this story, subscribe my channel for more beautiful stories.